of it. As Sylvia was saying, that the forum was the heart of the city. So you go to Rome, like even now, the forum is the heart of the city. And so this is where Paul would have gone in order to announce the gospel, to fulfill the gospel to the Corinthians. So let me just go to the scriptures. I want to hear how St. Luke describes Paul's visit to Corinth. This is the very beginning of chapter 18. Paul is leaving Athens and is on his way here to Corinth. After this, Paul left Athens and went on to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, for Emperor Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them and stayed to work with them, because he earned his living by making tents just as they did. He held discussions in the synagogue every Sabbath, trying to convince both Jews and Greeks. So Paul comes here, he meets some fellow Jews, Priscilla and Aquila, that married couple, are going to become very prominent in his ministry. And we know he always went to the synagogues first. We know that after that, then he began to announce the gospel to all people, to the Gentiles. When Silas and Timothy arrived in Macedonia, Paul gave his whole time to preaching the message, testifying to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. When they opposed him and said evil things about him, he protested by shaking the dust from his clothes and saying to them, "If you are lost, you yourselves must take the blame for it. I am not responsible. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." As Sylvia was saying, that Paul's normal course, Jews first in the synagogues, then he would go to the Gentiles. So he left them and went to live in the house of a Gentile named Titius Justus, who worshipped God. His house was next to the synagogue. Christus, who was the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with all his family, and many other people in Corinth heard the message, believed, and were baptized. One night Paul had a vision in which the Lord said to him, "Do not be afraid, but keep on speaking and do not give up, for I am with you. No one will be able to harm you, for many in this city are my people." So Paul stayed for a year and a half teaching the people the word of God. So you can imagine at this point Paul was like, "Okay, I'm probably ready to move on." The Lord appears and says, "No, I want you to stay. And there are many people here who are my people." So he stays for a year and a half. When Gallo, who was made the Roman governor of Achaia, Jews there got together, seized Paul and took him to court. This is right here. This is what Sylvia is speaking about. So Paul's brought to Gallo, to the local governor, in order to give testimony to explain what he's doing. This man, they said, is trying to persuade people to worship God in a way that is against the law. Paul was about to speak when Gallo said to the Jews, "If this were a matter of some evil crime or wrong that has been committed, it would be reasonable for you to be patient, for me to be patient with you Jews. But since it is an argument about words and names in your own law, you yourselves must settle it. I will not be the judge of such things." And he drove them out of the court. They all grabbed Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the court, but that did not bother Gallo a bit. So Paul's brought here. You can imagine this Roman governor is like, "What crime did he commit?" "Oh, well, he says Jesus is the Messiah." It's like, "Well, who's Jesus?" And what's a Messiah, right? "Well, our law says, our teaching says," and Gallo's like, "I'm not going to play those games. Right? There's no crime committed here. Get out of here. Just go." And the people were so upset. Sosthenes, who was one of the leaders of the local synagogue, became a Christian, and they beat Paul and Sosthenes on the way. And Gallo did not intervene. He didn't care. This isn't an issue of Rome. This is an issue of stability. So he moved. He's completely disinterested. All right. So that's the scriptures. That's Paul's first visit here. So what we can draw from Paul's time here is first missionary journey of Paul. He's there. He's back. We heard all about the very beginning of the Easter season. Very quick. Second missionary journey. We've been walking through that. And Paul's normal habit was that he would do a missionary journey, then he would go to Antioch. That was the center of Gentile Christianity. Basically recover, talk to the people there. Then he normally made a visit to Jerusalem, gave an update to the apostles. Then he would go back. Antioch really was his center of operations. Here at the end of the second missionary journey, we see something very unique. Paul establishes a new center here in Corinth. It's not because so many Corinthians were so adamant and so welcoming of the gospel. It's that the Lord told him, "No, you stay here. Like, there are many people here who belong to me." So Paul makes this the center of operations. Scriptures tell us he stays here a year and a half. He will come back here on many occasions. In fact, we know it's from Corinth during his first visit that from here he writes the first and second letter to the Thessalonians. Remember them? It feels we were there like 10 years ago, right? Right? But I'm sure even more so for Paul. Paul writes to the Thessalonians. He's worried about them. He's lived blamelessly. Because many Christians in Thessalonica were saying, well, look, this one guy Paul said that Jesus was going to come back. He's not coming back. And this is not an easy way of life. So we're just going to slack off and do our own things because it's not worth it. Obviously, Jesus isn't going to come back. So Paul, that's the earliest part of the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul writes and says, listen, we don't know when the Lord's coming back. But you better make sure that you're ready. And you should live blamelessly. You should follow his path regardless of when the Lord might return. So 1st and 2nd Thessalonians gets written from here. Later, when Paul returns to Corinth, we know that he writes his masterpiece, the letter to the Romans, from Corinth. So if you think the 14 apostolic letters that were written or influenced by St. Paul, the masterpiece, Romans, that's why it's right after the Gospels and Acts in the New Testament. Romans was written from Corinth. What are some other things that we can draw from Corinth? Well, he meets Priscilla and Aquila. Right? I want to stress, I know I've said this a couple times, but I want to stress how dear they become to him. That couple is one of the people that are most quoted or referenced by Paul later in his ministry. So he meets Priscilla and Aquila here. They're so dear to him that when he finally leaves Corinth, after about a year and a half on his first visit, he goes to Ephesus. He takes them with him. I think it's amazing that they're willing to go. They just pack up and say, yeah, okay. They just fled Rome because the emperor started persecution against the Jews. They come here. They're settling down. Paul comes and says, I'm going to move on to Ephesus, and they go. Paul follows the same habit. Just as he kind of created Corinth as his home base, he goes to Ephesus, and that really becomes his main home base. He's in Ephesus for 3 years. That becomes the main operations. In many respects, Ephesus starts to rival Antioch as the center of Gentile Christianity because Paul is resting there and working from Ephesus. And of course, Priscilla and Aquila go there, and eventually Paul does more missionary work. As I mentioned, Priscilla and Aquila, they govern the church as a married couple, and then Apollos comes, and Apollos eventually takes on leadership of the Ephesian community, and then that's eventually replaced by the first bishop, Timothy. And we saw the place there in the Agora. Agora is Greek for forum. So in the forum in Ephesus, we saw where Timothy died a martyr, where he was stoned to death. Okay, so that's a little bit of structure. What are some lessons? Well, remember that all of the apostolic letters in the New Testament, none of them were written. Paul didn't sit down and say, let me give a full summary of the gospel. Right? Paul didn't say, I'm going to write a catechism of what I'm preaching. No, that would be great, if only, right? Paul is writing letters to communities that have already accepted the gospel. It's kind of humbling to realize that all the apostolic letters are written to Christians. Because some of them, like to the Corinthians, he's like, stop the prostitution, stop the, pedophilia, stop this, stop that. You're like, my goodness, what is going on in this Christian community, right? So, again, the realization, he's speaking to Christians when he's writing the letters. The apostolic letters were written in order to address something that was wrong in the community, or that's being exaggerated or forgotten or dismissed. And so the geography that we're experiencing here is very important in terms of understanding what the Corinthian Christians are being influenced by and why Paul was writing. So we saw that temple to Aphrodite and that indulgence in affection and emotion, and we know about how popular temple prostitution was. Very, very popular. It was like a profession, right? Here in Corinth. So based on that, can we now understand why Paul would write the love chapter? He's clarifying what love is. So in our contemporary world, we think love is euphoria, love is warm fuzzies, love. Well, that was the same here, right? So Paul's correcting what's happening. Because of the indulgences of the Corinthian community, Paul imposes severe disciplines upon them. For example, women were not allowed to speak during the Eucharistic assembly here in Corinth, in large part because of the prominence of female prophetesses among the pagan religions, and because of temple prostitution. Women were not allowed to speak. Also in Corinth, women were commanded to wear veils because of the temple prostitution. So women covered their heads. The scriptures tell us that a woman's hair is her glory. Temple prostitutes were shaved. St. Paul says, women, you will cover your heads. Those were temporary disciplines given to this community in order to address problems. So once we're here and we can see what's happening, it's like, oh, that's why Paul said that. That's why that was so emphasized. That was why he stressed that point. Because the letters, each of the letters, all 21 of the apostolic letters in the New Testament, they're addressing something. So if someone just picks up one of the letters from the New Testament, reads it, that can be helpful, but very important that you understand the context and in some cases the geography of what's going on. So I'm trying to think if there's more to say about the Corinthian community because it's packed. This really becomes the center of the church for a long time. And the Corinthians are very dear to Paul. Let me mention this. When he's in Ephesus, he writes the first letter to the Corinthians from Ephesus here. He writes the second letter to the Corinthians when he's back in Macedonia. And that second letter, that's when he really kind of like drops the hammer. As Sylvia was saying, Paul was very severe with the Corinthians. I need to mention to you, the Corinthians were so rebellious that the faith was eventually lost in Corinth. So even within the early church in the early 90s, the Corinthians kicked out their bishop. So Timothy was the first bishop of Ephesus. We have bishops established in Corinth and other Christian communities. The Corinthians say, we don't want a bishop, they kick them out. And what's very interesting is, and this helps with the Catholic Orthodox understanding, is John the Apostle still alive at this point. So he is either in Patmos or most likely he's already returned to Ephesus after his time in Patmos. So you have a living apostle in close proximity. When the bishop is ousted, he doesn't go to John the Apostle. He goes to Clement of Rome, St. Peter's third successor, so the fourth bishop of Rome. He goes there because Clement holds the authority as chief apostle. And Clement wrote a letter to the Corinthians. You can still read it. We have to study in theology. And basically, Pope Clement says, you either take your bishop back or you're excommunicated. If you're not with your bishop, you're with the devil. And the Corinthians obey. They repent and they welcome their bishop back. It's one of the earliest recorded exercises of papal authority in the early church. And of course it was the Corinthians, right? They were always rebellious, always difficult to St. Paul into the early church. Let me say as well, in terms of the Corinthians, when Pope Clement writes to them, I always think it's interesting because Paul, in large part because of the Corinthians, you notice when he writes his letters, he always says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, selected by God. And he gives this almost like paragraph biography just in the intro. And the reason why is because his authority as an apostle was challenged specifically by the Corinthians. That you're not a real apostle. We have the super apostles, the 12. You're not even an apostle. Whoa. So that's why we have 2 Corinthians. But also that's why Paul gives that bio in every letter. Right? What's very interesting is when Clement writes to the Corinthians, Clement of Rome to the Christians of Corinth, boom. That's it. There's no bio. He doesn't need it. Everybody knows Clement of Rome is speaking with Peter's authority. Done. So just by way of compare and contrast, the authority that was already recognized in the early church of the successor of Peter and the games that Paul had to play in order for people to listen to him so he could preach the gospel, even within the household of faith, even among those who have been baptized. So far, so good?
Yep.
Yes.
Questions? What questions do you have?
Oh, here's a
Yeah,
question.
please.
As we're moving along in this first century, and we started out with the 12, and we know John's the last, by this time, how many are left that haven't been martyred?
Just by the time of Pope Clement or by the time that
Say
Paul is
Pope
here?
Clement, yeah.
By the time Pope Clement comes, all the apostles are dead. Most of their immediate successors are dead. We're on the third successor of Peter. We're in the fourth generation in Peter's line. So John is the only one. Not only still alive in terms of the apostles, but the only one still alive within that first and early second generation. So I joke around and say, talk about survivor's guilt, huh? You know. So John will go on to live almost to be 100. His many disciples. His main disciple Polycarp will also be blessed with extended life. He will live to his late 80s, and he will not die until the late 50s. So you imagine John's line, and then his first generation disciple lives until the 150s. That's amazing, right? Like we're talking about 120 years after the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus, approximately. And you still have that direct line from an apostle to the first generation disciple in the line of John. Rome is already almost 10th pope, right? So the other lines of the apostles are already far more extensive. Yes, John?
Okay, so you think about Corinth as an economic center,
Yep.
access to the world, worldly views,
Probably why the Lord told
Right.
Paul to stay here.
key area, and then compare that to the United States and the left and right coasts.
Yeah.
I see a lot of comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, again, as you're looking, the challenges that we have,
Sure.
that the challenge they have. I mean, do you agree with that? Does that make sense?
Sure,
And
sure.
what we're dealing with and what you talked about, go along and get along today.
Yeah, thank you. John's quoting the daily video from Daily Discipleship. Going along, getting along. But I'll say this, is we want to take the wisdom of the scriptures and apply it to our role as disciples and to the call to evangelization today. So definitely the scriptures are meant to be applied. And here in Corinth, as Sylvia was pointing out, like, you see a center point where two whole different parts of civilization are forced into interaction. Now you have a lot of sin because of that, but Paul will tell us where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more, right? So yeah, so we have wealth, you have prostitution, you have all the things that go along with the large city and with the transition point, right? In fact, Corinth had two ports, and so on. And it wouldn't be surprised. The Lord says, "Fly a surface and send as doves." And so that the Lord would say to Paul, because Paul was probably ready to move. Like, he's been moving pretty quickly, and he's probably ready to move on maybe to Ephesus or eventually to Antioch, right? Like that's his home. Really, if you think of a home for St. Paul, it's Antioch, and the Lord tells him to stay, and in large part probably strategically because this was going to be the place where more people would be able to hear the gospel. Can we take that wisdom and apply it to the United States today or to our own areas? Sure. I think it's very interesting later in Paul's life when he's brought before the Roman procurator, Roman governor in the Holy Land, and the Pharisees and Sadducees are looking to accuse him of crimes. He knows that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, they don't believe in angels. And Paul will use that in order to cause an argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, so much so the Roman governor, just get out. He just, like, I don't care about your religion. just get out. So Paul is very sly. Like, he knows what to do, what to say, in order to achieve the purpose, the greater purpose. So, yeah, I think the fact that the Lord would call him here in Corinth is pivotal. The fact that he would go to Ephesus and stay 3 years in Ephesus, right? Very surprising. His home was Antioch, and we see after his time in Ephesus, he goes back to Antioch. And also, Sylvia mentioned here, he shaves his head because he grieves and misses Jerusalem. Right? So he wants to get to Jerusalem. So I will shave my head as I wait to see Jerusalem. I will not allow my hair to grow until I see the holy city of Jerusalem again. Incidentally, that becomes the basis. You ever see monks where they have like their shaved head? It's called the tonsure. So that tonsure is for us, Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now heaven. So it used to be monks, and used to be even priests would have a tonsure. So a little bald. I probably just thought it was a bald spot, our older Catholics, but it was actually a purpose, kind of in a spiritual continuation of what Paul did. That we wait for the heavenly Jerusalem. So priests and monks wore tonsure. Monks still have the tonsure. So if you look at a monk, you think he's bald. He might be, right? But it might also be a tonsure. So, thank you. Anyone else?
What letters did Paul, what community did Paul write to from here?
From here. So there's a huge debate on some. I'll give you the ones that are generally agreed upon. First and second Thessalonians is written from Corinth. Romans will be written from Corinth during his third missionary journey. He'll come back. Those are the three that are almost universally agreed upon. There's other debates in terms of where the other letters were written. So we know that when he's in captivity, that's where he writes to Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy. He'll write to the Philippians from his house arrest in Rome. Paul's in house arrest for 2 years in Rome. He's able to receive people, receive guests. We know Luke visits him. And then from there he will write the Philippians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus. The other letters, there's a Corinthians is generally agreed from Ephesus. 2 Corinthians, most people would say from Philippi, but even that's a little debated. They say Macedonia somewhere, so normally we would think of Philippi.
So when they look at, he talked about in one of his letters, when you have him, he starts describing. I've been through shipwrecks. Where was that written? I can't remember.
Yes.
Where shipwrecks? I don't mean to boast.
Yes, yes.
Where was it? What letter is that?
I love whenever Paul says, I don't mean to boast.
Yeah, I don't mean to boast. And then he lays out, and then he
then
talks about it
boasts.
as an athlete running. I mean, I'm mixing a lot of things up.
No, you're right. No, he's got 2 Corinthians,
Okay.
and he's referencing the shipwreck in Malta,
Yep.
which is in the end of Acts of the Apostles, when he's actually on his way to Rome. Most of us we know, because when he gets to Rome, because he's a Roman citizen, he's allowed to appeal before the emperor.
Yep.
It takes time, and so he is in Rome for house arrest for 2 years before he dies a martyr.
Yep.
So that's shipwreck. But in 2 Corinthians, Paul really gives a whole
Yeah.
summary. I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done that.
His
But
resume.
also really beautiful in 2 Corinthians is we hear about his mystical experiences with the Lord.
Yeah.
And we would not have known about them. Let me conclude with this real quick while we're in Corinth. So he writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus to the Corinthians. The community of Corinth, the community here, isn't that amazing to say here, right? The community here is very dear to his mind and heart. And he writes specifically in 1 Corinthians 10, chapters 6 to 11, about the Eucharistic sacrifice. And he's grieved because it used to be that the celebration of the Eucharist occurred within a broader meal. It's called the agape. And it's actually here in Corinth where the agape begins to be, where there's a lot of crackdown. Eventually the agape meal ends, right? In large part because wealthy Christians would make poor Christians sit at their feet. James denounces that in his letter, right? And temple prostitution became a part of the agape in Corinth, you know, and things of that sort. So Paul is writing very severely, and now you know the context. If you read 1 Corinthians chapters 10 to 11, you can understand Paul is issuing disciplines to the Corinthians, and then he says, I received as of first importance what the Lord gave, and he gives us the account of the Last Supper. So he describes point by point. So we take the account given to us in the Synoptic Gospels. Remember, John doesn't tell us about the upper room. The Lord washed his feet in John, but we don't hear about the Eucharist in John, in the upper room. The Synoptic Gospels, we hear the accounts. We take Paul's account in 1 Corinthians and it parallels. And what that helps us to understand is that the Christians didn't speak often of the Eucharist. The Eucharist was for the baptized. The message, the agape, was for everyone, but the Eucharist was for the baptized. That's why John doesn't mention the Eucharist. John wrote his Gospel late. You don't speak about the Eucharist. There was a threat of syncretization, that the pagans would take it and mold it into something else. So John didn't speak about the Eucharist, but the process of the Eucharist. Paul is here addressing to the Eucharist of the Corinthians, and he's reminding them of how important it is that it be done with a proper spirit. He says, don't eat or drink in an unworthy manner. To make sure that when you celebrate the Eucharist, that you're doing so in an upright way. This helps us to understand that Paul, here in the 50s AD, has received the authority to celebrate the Eucharist, knows how to celebrate the Eucharist, is chastising and disciplining abuses towards the Eucharist and the agape meal that surrounded it at the time. And it helps us to understand that Paul understood, go and teach all nations and make disciples, was parallel with, do this in remembrance of me. So if we read the apostolic letters and we say, well, where's the Eucharist? We don't see the Eucharist being celebrated, right? Wouldn't they talk more about it? You would think that they would, and I'm sure they probably prefer that they could. But for the same reason John doesn't mention the Eucharist, we don't hear a lot about the Eucharistic sacrifice, the offering of the new covenant, the new Passover by the Christian leaders, because they were trying to avoid abuses by the pagans, by the non-believers. So, but in 1 Corinthians 10 to 11, Paul describes it. And it's one glimpse where it's like, yes, it was being celebrated, right? So we see that, yes, that was a central part of the Christian way of life, was to come together in order to celebrate the Lord's sacrifice. So Paul speaks about that, and he definitely puts in the context of a sacrifice. This wasn't a love meal. This wasn't, let's get together and hold hands and sing kumbaya. It's very clear. And so when you eat the bread, you participate in the Lord's own body. You participate in His sacrifice. So just as we understand it today, Paul is describing that in 1 Corinthians chapters 10 to 11. So, and there's so much more to be said. 1st and 2 Corinthians is a gold mine of reflection into Greco-Roman culture, the early church, and the mind and the spirituality of St. Paul. It is second. 1 Corinthians are only second to Romans itself, which is the masterpiece. Nothing can compete with Romans. Which is interesting, he wrote Romans here. Sound good? Well, let's do this in honor of Priscilla and Aquila. If I could